Well, good morning. We welcome you to the online service, particularly for the Crossville First United Methodist Church, but we are glad to have everyone listening in to this service of worship to God. I was wondering a couple of weeks ago, actually on Easter morning, about our use of the term virtual worship. And it occurred to me that the meaning of the word virtual is that it is something that is not as good or up to the standard of that which is real. And I was really convicted about using that terminology because I asked myself this question: what would happen if you and I would take worship seriously and believe that worship happens inside of us? Then the worship that we have online would not be virtual worship, but it would be genuine worship of God. And I invite you this morning, or whenever you are listening in, to see this online worship not virtually, but as a genuine expression of our love and faith in Jesus Christ. As we have done every Sunday for the past few weeks, as a reminder of God's presence with us and among us, I will light this candle on the table beside me, reminding us that God is always here. This morning's gospel lesson found from the lectionary is from Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. And we invite you not only to follow along in your Bibles, but to hear the message that God is trying to give to each and every one of us. Will you hear these words? Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of these holy words. Some have described the Christian life as a walk with Jesus. That's a very important image that we have in our minds about that, because it is indeed a walk. It reminds us that we are to take this journey seriously, that it is not a mad dash or a sprint. Neither is it a place where we are content to stand in one place and not move at all. But it is a walk. It is a marathon, a place where you and I continue to walk with Jesus every step of the way, slowly and very intently, learning from him and acknowledging that he is indeed the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, and that he is the one who guides us throughout life. As I was studying for the message this morning, I could not really point a time or place my finger on the period of time when I began to walk with Jesus in my own life. For as long as I can remember, I have been a part of the Christian church, and I have attempted to follow Jesus and walk with Jesus along this journey called life for many, many years now. True, there have been periods of time, some days, some weeks, sometimes even months, where I have not adequately listened to Jesus along this walk. And yet I've realized that the most important thing is not that I was trying to walk with Jesus, but I was reminded each and every step of the way that Jesus was walking with me, whether I realized it or not, or whether I acknowledged it or not. Indeed, it is more important to realize and acknowledge that Jesus walks with us than it is for us to acknowledge that we are walking with him. Because of our humanness and our finiteness, there will always be periods of time in our spiritual journey when we do not adequately listen to the voice of Jesus in our hearts, telling us how we should conduct our lives and live as people of Easter. As important as it is for us to make that commitment and walk with Jesus throughout every step of life, it is even more important for us to acknowledge that no matter whether we feel it or not, God walks with us in the person and life of Jesus Christ. All of us this morning should be thankful that Jesus has initiated this offer of walking with him, of reminding us that even before we were aware of it, that he was walking with us. And For that we are eternally grateful. This morning's message is one of the most popular stories in the Easter story. It happens on the evening of Jesus' resurrection when two individuals are on their way from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. We're told in the story that these travelers, one of them known as Cleopas, also known as Simon, and the other person who is unnamed to us in the Gospel according to Luke. But we are told that these two journeymen who were on their way to Emmaus were walking along, and they were very dejected and sad. They had just witnessed the crucifixion of one of their best friends, perhaps their very best friend, Jesus of Nazareth. And as they were walking to Emmaus, they were discussing along the road these events and what they meant for them personally. We're not told exactly what they were discussing, but I am certain that as a part of that particular conversation, these two followers of Jesus were wondering and fearful for their own lives. After all, if they had the audacity to put Jesus to death, what would they do to those persons who were identified as friends and followers of his? Perhaps the thing that preoccupied their thoughts and minds more than anything else as they wondered and feared for their own safety. Would the religious authorities and the chief priests and scribes come after them next to silence them, to prevent the crowds from having allegiance to Jesus as their Lord and Savior? We're told in Luke 24 that they were sad as they stood still in one point of their journey walking with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. That gives us a glimpse of what they were feeling as they walked from Jerusalem to Emmaus along that dirty and dusty pathway. They were preoccupied with the grief and the mourning that they had experienced from this person that they had loved and trusted for a few years now, that he finally was no longer among them. That finally the ministry that had taken place had led to his ultimate death at the hands of his enemies. And they were in a great amount of grief and mourning over their loss. We're not told this, but I imagine in my own mind that these disciples, Cleopas and the other one who is unnamed, probably were crying along the road as they walked to Emmaus. They were very sad because it's very difficult when we lose those who are most important to us. And yet, for whatever reason, they walked to Emmaus. Perhaps it was their home. Perhaps they were going there to grieve with those who hurt alongside them. Perhaps it was just helpful to them to be able to spend time, just the two of them, walking perhaps side by side, trying to offer words of peace and comfort to the other in their time of need. We are told by the writer of the Gospel according to Luke that their eyes were kept from seeing. Over the years, I've heard many people try to explain this, that was God's intention for their eyes to be blinded from knowing that it was Jesus who was walking along the road with them. But I believe that there's something else going on there when the gospel writer tells us that their eyes were closed and could not see. I believe that what prevented them from acknowledging and seeing that it was Jesus who walked with them along this dusty pathway, this pathway of grief, was because that they were so overcome with their circumstances that they could not see Jesus walking right beside them. After all, it is in our human nature to do the same. Every time when our lives seem to be crumbling and falling apart at the seams, we tend to focus upon our circumstances or upon our challenges or struggles, that we fail to either recognize or see that Jesus is walking there beside us. Particularly in this time of physical distancing from one another, it would be natural for us to feel the same way that they do. We are trying to walk through this adequately and faithfully, placing our trust and our obedience in Jesus. And yet at times this challenge is so overwhelming that you and I cannot even acknowledge or see Jesus as walking through this difficult season with us. It is indeed a time when you and I allow our circumstances to control our attention rather than looking to Jesus who walks beside us. This time when we are faced with many challenges, worries about our economy, about the future of the church, about our family and loved ones and our friends, wondering if we too will lose our jobs like so many others have done around us, wondering when we will get to see those who are most vulnerable that we love so dearly. It would be so easy for us to be lured into the temptation of focusing upon our circumstances rather than the God who walks with us in Jesus Christ. The disciples, as they walk along, they finally acknowledge that there is someone who walks with them. Jesus asks them a question. He says, "What was it that you were talking about when you were walking on the road with one another?" Cleopas speaks up and he asks Jesus a question. He said, "Are you the only stranger who does not know what has taken place in Jerusalem during these days?" Jesus looks back at Cleopas and he responds with a question of his own. He says, "What things are you speaking of?" And Cleopas, almost nonchalantly and almost arrogantly, says, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet in word and deed to God and the people, and how our leaders, the chief priests and scribes, had him crucified and put to death. Are you the only one who does not know about this?" I am thinking this morning that is even a pertinent question for us, even almost 21 centuries after this has transpired. There are people in the world who are hungry and they need to hear the story of Jesus crucified and being raised from the dead for the sins of the human race. What greater mission do we have as the church and as faithful disciples of Jesus Christ than to communicate to the world that is lost and dying without hope of him, that he has indeed been crucified for the sins of the world, and he has been raised in order that you and I can experience resurrection power in our own being. Jesus begins to speak in broad terms to them, and we're told by the writer of the Gospel according to Luke that Jesus chooses this opportunity to start with the prophets and work his way through this crucifixion event and resurrection to explain to them and unpack to them the meaning of the coming of the Messiah. Cleopas and the other disciple who had walked with Jesus on that road to Emmaus had it in their mind that they had hoped for the longest that this Jesus of Nazareth would be the one who would come to redeem Israel. their own expectations were really unreal, because they had hoped that when the Messiah had come, that this Messiah would alleviate all the evil and all the discord and all the hostility and hatred that existed in the human race. And when human beings continued to act that way, it brought a question to all of their minds. Is this Jesus really the Messiah? For if he were the Messiah, why would he allow them to kill him? He should be infinite in power and wisdom and might. But Jesus sometimes comes and erases all of our untrue expectations of how he should behave in relation to the world. Instead of coming and wielding power and sword and hurting people by overcoming them with the physical force of nature, Jesus comes in all humility and self-sacrificial love. And that's something that we human beings have difficulty understanding and comprehending. As Jesus and the two disciples enter the village of Emmaus, Jesus pretends as he is going to walk further and leave them to their business. It is then that these two disciples invite Jesus to come and have dinner with them there in the village of Emmaus. Jesus responds affirmative to their invitation, and is there at that table that we find that Jesus takes the bread and he blesses the bread and he prays over it. And as he distributes the bread to them, we are told by the writer of the Gospel according to Luke that their eyes were opened when Jesus broke the bread. That is really difficult for us to even hear this morning because of the physical distancing and the stay-at-home orders. We're reminded of our inability to gather together as the people of God to receive a commemoration of this Jesus breaking the bread with his disciples. It is a constant reminder to all of us when we do gather for worship once again as a corporate body that it is in the simple breaking of the bread and the drinking of the juice, physical reminders of Jesus' body and his broken blood that were given for the sins of the human race. It is in that sacrament of Holy Communion that you and I are reminded too that Jesus reveals his divine nature and his holy love to each and every one of us. Perhaps it is a call to be mindful of the importance of this sacrament of the Holy Church. That when we get together again and are able to celebrate this sacrament as a corporate body, that it will be even more meaningful and it will reveal to us the love and the grace of Jesus Christ. I so look forward to that time with you. Another thought that I had is the disciples broke the bread with Jesus, and he was revealed to them in the breaking of the bread. We are told by Luke that Jesus vanishes from their sight. Not long after they finish their meal together, Jesus goes with them. Jesus goes and they are left to go and be in the presence of their friends and the others who are his disciples. They share this story of walking on the road to Emmaus with Jesus. And they recollect that while he was opening the scriptures about himself to them, that their hearts were burning within them. Could it be that Jesus wants our hearts to be burning within us every time that we open up the Holy Writ and we read it for ourselves, seeking the truth and the characteristics of a holy God? How many times do we not take it very seriously when we open the pages of this holy book, not even realizing that Jesus expects all of us to open it up and to listen to his voice speaking to us, trying to mold us and shape us into the persons that he has created us to be. This story always reminds me not only of the importance of seeking the presence and the love and the grace of Jesus in the sacrament of Holy Communion, but it reminds me of the sincerity and the genuine disposition that all of us should have when reading this holy book in our devotional time. It is indeed a map that leads to eternal life if we will only treat it in such a serious manner. Today we are 2 weeks out of Resurrection Sunday, but we continue to walk together during this season of Easter. Many of us will go back to a way that we have once lived pre-Easter. But many of us, the Easter event has had such a dramatic impact upon us that we will never be the same. We remember the importance of Jesus walking with us and us responding by walking with him. This morning, all of us are on this journey. Some of us have been advanced for many years, and I give thanks to God for each and every one of you. While there are others on the other end of the spectrum who are just beginning their journey with Jesus, some of them not even recognizing that Jesus is already walking with them. This morning I'll leave you with a couple or 3 thoughts about this passage that applies to our own lives. 1, we should never forget that no matter where we are, that Jesus walks with us, whether we acknowledge it or recognize it or see it. 2, as a result of Jesus walking with us, Jesus calls us to acknowledge his presence and that we make a conscientious effort to walk with him, not only to feel his presence or his power and his redemption, but we acknowledge that Jesus continues to teach us and lead us and guide us through the decisions that we make every single day. And that is the purpose of his walking with us. If we acknowledge his presence and his power with us, he will continue to guide us and strengthen us and help us to make the best decisions that will lead to the life that he comes to offer us. And we are reminded that worship and spiritual growth can happen anywhere, at any place, at any time. And I invite you this morning, even in the midst of this physical distancing, in the midst of our stay-at-home orders, in the midst of our grief and our pain, our struggles and our disappointments, to always remember that even in the midst of our tears, that Jesus walks with us. And every time that we acknowledge that Jesus is walking with us, he brings a sense of joy and peace into the midst of trials and tribulations that we face in life. Just the simple knowledge of knowing that Jesus is walking with us through this pandemic and these unprecedented times is a source of great joy and assurance. We will make it through this. We will get through all the trials and the tribulations of life. Jesus will continue to bring peace and comfort and assurance to each and every one of you. And I pray as you go throughout this day and throughout your walk and journey of faith, that you always be reminded that Jesus always walks with you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.